The year is 1932. A woman named Mabel Strickland stands in a kitchen in Youngstown, Ohio, where 40% of the men are out of work and the steel mills have gone quiet. On the stove is a pot she started at 6 in the morning. It is past noon. She has not eaten today. She is saving her portion for her children. What is in that pot would make a modern food blogger weep, not from disgust, but from recognition. Bones, water, a heel of bread going gray at the edges. 3 wilted celery stalks from a grocer who felt sorry for her. And something she learned from her mother, who learned it from hers. Patience. The understanding that heat and time could pull nourishment from things that looked like nothing. Between 1929 and 1939, the American food system didn't collapse. It inverted. The people who had the least figured out the most. They foraged city lots for greens that ancient civilizations had eaten for centuries. They rendered every scrap of fat, stretched 1 egg into 4 servings, built cakes without butter or milk, and created dishes so technically precise that modern chefs have spent decades trying to replicate them without understanding why they worked. Number 7 on this list was served in hobo camps from California to the Carolinas, and has since been rebranded by gastropubs at $14 a bowl. Number 3 was given away free by butchers who thought they were doing the poor a favor. They had no idea they were handing over one of the most nutrient-dense preparations in human culinary history. And number 1 was the thing that kept families from fracturing completely. Not just from hunger, from despair. The Great Depression did not create bad food. It created invisible food. Meals made by women whose names were never recorded, whose techniques were never written down, whose kitchens were condemned by health inspectors who had never missed a meal in their lives. This is what they actually ate. Number 20, Mulligan stew. Sometime around 1931, outside Bakersfield, California, a man called Slim built a fire between 2 rocks and set a dented pot over it. He had a carrot pulled from a field 3 miles back, half an onion, a potato with the bad parts cut off, and a piece of salt pork no bigger than his thumb. The men around him had less. So everything went into the pot and nobody asked whose carrot it was. Mulligan stew had no recipe because it had no fixed ingredients. It was whatever the camp had, pooled and cooked until it became something greater than its parts. Fat renders into water. Starch thickens it. Salt, pork seasons everything. Food scientists would later call this umami layering and collagen conversion. The men called it supper. Hobo camps were regularly raided. Vagrancy laws made it illegal to be poor and stationary. Cooking fires were cited as public hazards. When the camps were cleared, the stew went with them. Not into cookbooks, not into restaurants. Into nothing. Today, communal one-pot cooking is the subject of food documentaries and farm-to-table dinners where guests pay $80 to eat something rustic together. The men outside Bakersfield were doing it because the alternative was going to bed with nothing. Number 19, Dandelion greens. In the spring of 1933, in the Italian neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, you could tell how bad the week had been by looking at the vacant lots. When times were hard, the dandelions were gone by Tuesday. Women moved through the lots in the early morning pulling plants before the flower opened, when the bitterness was still manageable. They had learned this in Calabria, in Sicily. They brought it across the ocean because hunger doesn't care what country you're in. The technique was deliberate. Blanch first to pull the sharpest bitterness out. Drain. Sauté in lard or olive oil with garlic and a splash of vinegar. The result was deeply savory, slightly bitter, mineral in a way that no iceberg lettuce has ever approached. The women knew the bitterness was the point. Bitter meant alive. Bitter meant it was doing something. What it was doing was extraordinary. Dandelion greens contain more beta-carotene than carrots, more calcium than milk by weight, more iron than spinach. The women picking them from vacant lots didn't know this in those terms. They knew their grandmothers had eaten them. They knew their children looked better in spring than in winter. That was enough. As Italian-American families moved to the suburbs in the 1950s, the vacant lots disappeared. Bitterness began to feel like poverty. The same green is now sold at Whole Foods for $4 a bunch, marketed as a detox superfood. The women of South Philadelphia were calling it Tuesday. Number 18. Cornmeal mush. In the rural South in 1934, breakfast for a family of 6 might cost 3 cents. Not 3 cents each, total. A pound of cornmeal cost a nickel and lasted 4 days. You boiled it in salted water, stirring constantly until it pulled away from the sides of the pot in thick, slow waves. You ate it with whatever you had. Sorghum syrup, a spoonful of lard, buttermilk if the cow was giving. The women who made it every morning developed a feel for the pot that no recipe could teach. And they knew something else. Leftover mush poured into a pan and left to set overnight became something entirely different by morning. Sliced cold and fried in lard until a crust formed. 2 completely different meals from one ingredient. The same penny spent twice. In the Deep South, black families were routinely passed over by white-administered relief boards, forced to stretch their own supplies further than anyone should have had to. The ingenuity in those kitchens was not optional. It was survival arithmetic performed under conditions of deliberate exclusion. Post-war cereal companies spent millions convincing America that boxed cereal was modern, and cornmeal mush was something to leave behind. It is now called polenta. $12 as a side dish served with truffle oil. The technique is identical. The story told about it is entirely different. Number 17. Cream chipped beef on toast. In 1931, the U.S. Army was serving it. So were diners, boarding houses, and church basement kitchens feeding men who couldn't feed themselves. Cream chipped beef on toast was everywhere because it was cheap, filling, and reproducible by anyone. The beef was dried and salted, stable without refrigeration for months, a nickel for enough to feed a family. Reconstituted in hot water, torn into pieces, folded into a white sauce, and served over toast. 1 or 2 ounces of beef, distributed through a cup of cream sauce, flavored the entire dish. This is the logic of seasoning as survival strategy. Soldiers who ate it during the Depression and again in World War II gave it a name that cannot be printed here. Served in massive institutional quantities, the salt never drawn out, the sauce gluey and pale, the dish absorbed the reputation of its worst versions and never recovered. What that obscured was that a skilled boarding house cook in Cincinnati in 1933, who balanced the salt, thinned the sauce correctly, served it over properly toasted bread, was producing something men paid 30 cents for and came back for the next day. The craft was real. The institution killed it by scaling it beyond any craft's ability to survive. It has never been reclaimed by the artisanal food world. The woman in Cincinnati who knew exactly what she was doing has never been given credit for it. Number 16. Potato soup. In Cleveland's Tremont neighborhood in 1930, a Polish woman named Władysława, everyone called her Wanda, made potato soup every Thursday. Thursday because that was the day before payday, when the pantry was closest to empty. 3 potatoes, 1 onion, water, salt, a bay leaf she'd been using for 2 weeks and would use for 2 more. She cut half the potatoes into chunks and mashed the other half directly into the broth. No flour, no cream, no roux. Potato starch thickened the soup from the inside, creating a body that was silky and substantial without requiring anything she didn't already have. Professional chefs call this technique liaison. French restaurants charge for it. Wanda did it because flour cost money and potatoes were already in the pot. As Eastern European immigrant families climbed into the post-war middle class, potato soup became embarrassing. Poor food. They bought Campbell's and called it an upgrade. The specific technique, the mashed-in starch, the bay leaf used until it had nothing left, died with the women who knew it. Potato soup is on gastropub menus right now, described as rustic and house-made, at $11 a bowl. Wanda made it for pennies on the worst Thursday of every week. Hers was almost certainly better. Number 15. Navy beans and ham hocks. In the black neighborhoods of Birmingham, Alabama in 1932, the ham hock was not a compromise. It was the choice of a cook who understood that the most flavor in any pig lived not in the expensive cuts at the front of the butcher case, but in the parts pushed to the back. The hock is the ankle, mostly skin, bone, cartilage. It costs almost nothing. Over enough time, it becomes something a pork loin could never be. Soak the beans overnight, add the hock, bring to a boil, skim the foam, drop to a bare simmer. 4 hours minimum. 6 was better. 8 was best. The collagen in the hock's skin dissolved slowly into the broth, turning it glossy, coating the back of a spoon. The beans absorbed it. By hour 6, the broth was rich without a single drop of added fat, and the meat fell from the bone in threads that distributed through the pot like a rumor. You could not rush it. The time was the ingredient. The USDA would later confirm what every grandmother in Birmingham already knew. Slow-cooked collagen-rich broth produces gelatin with measurable anti-inflammatory properties. This is not folk medicine. This is food science arriving late to a party that started a century earlier. In high-end southern restaurants, this has been reborn as a composed plate, a glossy hock over white beans, finished with pork just, priced at $26. The women in Birmingham were making that broth on their way to something they considered ordinary. Number 14. Lard sandwiches. In the coal mining towns of eastern Kentucky in October 1934, a child named Russell carried his lunch to school in a paper bag so reused it had gone soft as cloth. Inside, 2 slices of bread, spread with lard salted. That was the sandwich. He ate it at his desk because the school had no cafeteria, and he did not think of it as deprivation because every other child in the room had something similar, and because he was hungry enough that the fat and salt and bread tasted exactly like what it was. Fuel. Delivered in the most efficient form available. Lard in 1934 was not the villain it would later become. Rendered pork fat stored in ceramic crocks, stable without refrigeration, 115 calories per tablespoon. It cost almost nothing and did everything. Fried, baked, spread, sealed. The cultural ban came after the war. In 1961, a physiologist published research linking saturated fat to heart disease, and the food industry responded, not because the science was settled, which it wasn't, but because there was money to be made in its uncertainty. Crisco was repositioned as a health product. Lard was cast as primitive and dangerous. What subsequent nutritional science confirmed is that lard contains significant oleic acid, the same monounsaturated fat found in olive oil, and is more stable at cooking temperatures than the vegetable oils that replaced it. The child in Kentucky was not eating something dangerous, he was eating something that worked. Pastured lard now sells at farmers markets for $12 a jar. Russell would find this very funny, or possibly not funny at all. Number 13. Poke salat. In the hill country of Tennessee in 1935, there was a window of about 3 weeks in early spring when pokeweed was safe to eat. And everyone who grew up in those hills knew exactly when that window opened and when it closed. The young shoots, no more than 6 inches tall, before the leaves fully unfurled, those were food. The mature plant was poison, not metaphorically. The compounds in it caused convulsions and, in sufficient quantity, death. The plant announced this with color. The deep warning purple of something that had decided to defend itself. You picked only the young shoots. You boiled them in a full pot of water, drained completely, boiled again, drained again, sometimes a third time. Each boil pulled more toxins out. The final product, tender, dark green, earthier than spinach or asparagus, was fried in bacon grease with onion until the edges crisped. The danger had been cooked out. What remained was extraordinary. The triple boil method is a precise extraction technique that reduces alkaloid concentration to safe levels through repeated thermal processing. The same basic chemistry used industrially to process certain legumes. The hill women of Tennessee had worked this out empirically over generations, without chemistry degrees, by paying attention to what happened when you did it wrong. When those women died in cities far from the hills where the knowledge had developed, the knowledge went with them. Polka salat exists today as a folk memory and a country song. Food foragers in Appalachian revival communities have begun reconstructing it from interviews with elderly women in rural Tennessee. It appears on a handful of menus with careful preparation notes. the notes would have made the women who made it every spring laugh. They didn't need a note, they just knew. Number 12. Depression-era chocolate cake. In 1936, in an apartment in Kansas City, a woman named Dorothy mixed vinegar into baking soda, watched it fizz, and understood, with the certainty of someone who could not afford to waste flour, that she had just made her leavening agent. No eggs, no butter, no milk. Flour, sugar, cocoa powder, oil, vinegar, vanilla. And the knowledge passed between women in church bulletins and on the backs of commodity flour bags. These things, combined correctly, produced a chocolate cake that was moist, dark, and genuinely good. The chemistry is elegant. Vinegar reacts with baking soda to produce the lift that eggs normally provide. Oil keeps the crumb tender without developing gluten. Cocoa deepens in flavor when it meets alkaline baking soda. The cake works not despite the missing ingredients, but because of what replaced them. Dorothy mixed it directly in the baking pan, made 3 wells in the flour, poured the wet ingredients in separately, stirred with a fork. 1 pan, 3 minutes of cleanup, 35 minutes in the oven. When it came out, it smelled like every birthday her children had ever known, and they did not know or care that it had cost less than 15 cents. As post-war baking moved toward richer, more expensive layer cakes, wacky cake became the embarrassment, the thing you made when you'd forgotten to go to the store. Modern vegan bakers have rediscovered it and expressed genuine amazement at how well it works, crediting the chemistry rather than the Depression-era women who worked it out empirically in their baking pans out of necessity 50 years before the word vegan entered common usage. Number 11. Egg drop soup. In the Chinese immigrant neighborhoods of San Francisco in 1931, an egg cost 2 cents. 1 egg dropped into a quart of hot broth and stirred in a slow circle so it ribboned through the liquid in thin silken threads could feed 4 people something that felt like a meal. The broth had to be just below a rolling boil. The egg beaten lightly, poured in a thin stream while stirring in one continuous direction. Too hot and it scrambled. Too cool and it clouded the broth. The right temperature produced pale yellow ribbons suspended in clear liquid. It looked like it had taken effort. It had taken attention, which is different from effort and in some ways more demanding. American families without that tradition found the same logic independently. A raw egg beaten into hot potato water or bean broth, thickening it slightly, adding protein, transforming it. It appeared in Midwestern church cookbooks of the era as egg flour soup, arriving through no clear cultural pathway, suggesting the technique traveled by observation and necessity rather than formal exchange. When food works, people notice. When people are hungry enough, they stop asking where it came from. The Depression-era American adaptation disappeared almost entirely, leaving no record except in penciled notes in church recipe collections that nobody has digitized. Egg drop soup remains on every Chinese-American restaurant menu, still one of the most technically precise things a kitchen produces. The women making it in San Francisco in 1931, and the women in Ohio who watched and adapted, they were working in the same tradition without knowing it. Number 10. Fried salt pork. In the sharecropper cabins of the Mississippi Delta in 1933, the salt pork barrel sat in the corner of every kitchen that had one. Salt pork was not bacon. It was fat back. The thick layer from the pig's back, packed in salt, dense and nearly translucent, stable without refrigeration for months. 4 cents a pound. A family could buy enough to last a week for less than a quarter. You soaked it first. 30 minutes to overnight in cold water, pulling the excess salt out until the meat was edible rather than punishing. Then dredged in flour, laid in a cast iron skillet, fried slow. The fat rendered into the pan and the pork fried in its own fat, producing a golden crackling crust while the interior stayed soft. What remained in the pan was the next 3 meals. Biscuits fried in it, greens wilted in it, cornbread baked in a pan coated with it. The drippings jar was the real technology. A ceramic container collecting rendered fat from every cooking session. Layered, older fat on the bottom, newer on top, each layer contributing its flavor to whatever cooked next. A skillet of cornbread cooked in weeks of accumulated drippings had a depth that fresh lard could never replicate. The jar was a cumulative record of every meal the family had eaten, rendered into fat. It disappeared in a single post-war generation, replaced by Crisco and then by cooking spray, each substitution more convenient and slightly less flavorful than the last. Number 9. Vinegar pie. In the farmhouses of rural Appalachia in 1931, dessert was not optional. The women running those households understood that a meal without sweetness at the end affected morale, and morale in a household where the adults hadn't slept properly in 3 years because of financial terror was not a luxury consideration. It was a management decision. Fruit cost money, sugar cost money. What was available was apple cider vinegar. Homemade, a byproduct of the apple harvest, keeping indefinitely in a stone crock. And eggs if the chickens were laying, and flour. Standard pie crust. For the filling, eggs, sugar, a substantial pour of apple cider vinegar gently cooked into a custard. The vinegar did something unexpected in the heat. Its sharpest acidity mellowed and rounded, leaving a flavor that was bright, tart, faintly floral, with a deep apple undertone running beneath the sweetness. It tasted like a fruit pie made from a fruit that didn't quite exist. The FDA's commercial labeling standards in the late 1930s had no category for pies made without fruit. Vinegar pie could not be sold or distributed commercially. It remained entirely domestic, and when the women who made it stopped needing to, they stopped making it. Their daughters bought canned cherry filling and called it an improvement. It appears at heritage food festivals in eastern Kentucky today, served to people who taste it and say with genuine surprise that it tastes like something. Like fruit, almost. The women who made it in 1931 would not have found this surprising. They made it taste that way on purpose. Number 8. Breadcrumb omelette. On a Friday morning in the row houses of South Boston in 1932, the bread had been on the counter since Monday. In a house with money, it would have been thrown away. In a house without, it became breakfast. Broken into coarse crumbs, soaked briefly in milk or water until soft, folded into a beaten egg, cooked in a skillet with a thin film of lard until the exterior set and the interior stayed soft. Not quite an omelet, not quite a frittata. Something older than either. Breadcrumbs held moisture within the egg mixture, slowing the cooking and keeping the interior soft even as the exterior crisp. The starch gelatinized slightly, giving the whole thing body and chew. A plain scrambled egg is done in 2 minutes. A breadcrumb omelet takes 5 and feeds more people with less egg, and sits in the stomach the way working people needed breakfast to sit. The Irish and Italian women of South Boston were drawing on a tradition stretching centuries back. The European peasant logic of stale bread as extender, thickener, protein stretcher. Ribollita in Tuscany, panada in Spain. The breadcrumb omelet was the Depression-era American expression of a logic so old it predated the concept of waste. It has not been reclaimed by the artisanal food world. It is too honest for that, too direct about what it is and where it came from. It is simply what a woman made on a Friday morning in 1932 when the bread had gone hard and the egg had to last. And it was good enough to feed her family, and that should be enough, and somehow it isn't. Number 7. Hoover stew. The name was not affectionate. In the shantytown camps ringing every major American city by 1932, already being called Hoovervilles. After the president who had assured the country that prosperity was just around the corner, the stew that appeared most frequently in the communal cookpots carried his name like an indictment. The stew was made from hot dogs and canned tomatoes and whatever pasta or dried beans could be scrounged. It was the primary meal of somewhere between 1 and 2 million Americans living in cardboard and scrap lumber on the edges of cities that had decided they didn't exist. Hot dogs because they were the cheapest processed meat available, a nickel for a package, and because their fat and salt punched above their weight in a pot of liquid. Canned tomatoes at 10 cents a can, the liquid as important as the fruit. Macaroni or dried beans absorbing everything, swelling into something that filled the pot and the stomach. The dish expanded to accommodate whoever showed up. You added more water and more of whatever you had, and the fundamental logic held regardless of proportion. This adaptability was not a flaw in the recipe. It was the recipe. The Hoovervilles were demolished as the New Deal provided alternatives. The stew went with them, not into cookbooks, but into the silence of things too associated with shame to be preserved. The men and women who ate it spent the rest of their lives not talking about it. Hoover stew has no gastropub version, no heritage chapter. It exists only in oral histories and faded relief organization records. It is the most political dish on this list. It carries the name of the failure on purpose. The people who named it had nothing left but that. Number 6. Crackling bread. In the hog-killing season of November 1933 in rural North Carolina, rendering lard was a day-long community event that left behind something the women had been waiting for since the previous November. When you render lard, cook the pig's fat low and slow until it melts. What remains after the liquid fat is ladled off are cracklings. Small pieces of rendered pork skin, golden and crisp, with a texture that moves from crunch to chew and a flavor that is simultaneously porky, nutty, and caramelized. The cracklings were not a byproduct. They were the point. Folded warm into cornbread batter, a cup of cracklings to a cup and a half of cornmeal, with eggs, buttermilk, and salt, poured into a cast iron skillet smoking in the oven. The batter sizzled at the edges the moment it hit. In the oven, cracklings distributed unevenly through the bread, some crisping further near the surface, some staying soft in the interior, releasing fat into the surrounding crumb. A bottom crust so dark it shattered when you broke the first piece away. Commercial lard separated the crackling from the bread permanently. Industrial fat production meant the rendering was already done before the tin reached the shelf. Without the crackling, the bread became ordinary. The knowledge of how to fold them in, warm, quickly, so the batter didn't deflate, became unnecessary because the material requiring it had disappeared. The women who knew didn't forget. The world stopped requiring them to know. Then they died, and the knowledge went with them. The nose-to-tail cooking movement has brought crackling bread to restaurant menus at $22 a skillet. It is good. It is probably not as good as what came out of the cast iron in North Carolina in November 1933, when the cracklings were still warm and the skillet had been seasoning for 30 years. Number 5. Stuffed cabbage. In the Polish and Hungarian neighborhoods of Chicago's near northwest side in 1930, cabbage cost 2 cents a head. In the hands of someone who knew what they were doing, it was also a vessel. Outer leaves blanched until pliable, filled with a mixture of rice and whatever meat was almost available. A quarter pound of ground pork stretched with cooked rice, onion, and egg until the meat was more suggestion than substance. Packed into a pot, covered with tomato sauce, cooked low and slow for 2 hours. A quarter pound of ground pork feeds 1 person. Mixed with a cup of cooked rice and an egg, it feeds 4. And if the ratio is right and the heat is low enough, the 4 people eating do not feel the absence. The rice has done its work invisibly. The tomato sauce braised the rolls while simultaneously absorbing everything that cooked out of them, concentrating into something that tasted of the whole pot. The cook who tasted the sauce after 2 hours was tasting every decision she had made. If the sauce was right, everything was right. The women who made this in Chicago had learned it in Krakow and Budapest from mothers who had learned it in conditions not unlike the Depression. The dish traveled across the Atlantic already adapted to scarcity. It was a Depression food before the Depression existed. As these families moved to the Chicago suburbs in the 1940s and 1950s, stuffed cabbage became private, cooked for family gatherings, never offered to neighbors who might not understand it. The specific knowledge stayed within families. When a grandmother died before her daughter had been taught, that particular version went with her. The dish continued. The particular expression did not. Every person whose grandmother made stuffed cabbage knows the restaurant version is not quite right. The difference lives in a ratio and 2 hours of low heat and the judgment of a woman who had made it 200 times. That knowledge is almost entirely gone. Number 4. Relief flour biscuits. In February 1934, the federal government distributed commodity flour to approximately 4 million American families. It came in plain cotton sacks. No brand, no recipe, no cheerful illustration. Just flour, and the assumption that the families receiving it knew what to do with it. Some did, some were learning, and some were doing something the relief agencies hadn't anticipated. They were making it good. The flour was not good flour. Lower grade, coarser, less consistent in protein content. It produced dense, gummy biscuits if handled the way a baker accustomed to better flour would handle it. A woman in rural Georgia who made bad biscuits with relief flour went hungry. A woman who understood this flour needed less working, more fat, colder hands, and a hotter oven made something that rose and flaked and tasted against all expectation, like dignity. The fat had to be cold, cut into the flour in pieces large enough to remain distinct, melting in the oven into steam pockets that became flake. Liquid added cold, stirred only until the dough just came together, because every additional stir moved the texture from tender toward tough. Cut straight down, never twisted. Oven at 450 degrees minimum. None of this was in any relief document. It was encoded in the physical memory of women who knew by the resistance in their palms when the dough was ready. In the Deep South, black families received lower-grade commodity flour through deliberately inequitable distribution. The biscuits that came out of those households were, by every account, extraordinary. Skill compensated for material in ways the relief system had not calculated and did not credit. Bisquick arrived and promised biscuits without the knowledge. It delivered something biscuit-shaped. The women who had calibrated their hands to inferior material and produced something remarkable watched the culture decide their knowledge was an inconvenience that technology had solved. The technology had not solved it. It had replaced it with something easier and lesser and called the replacement progress. Number 3. Bone broth soup. On a Thursday morning in the winter of 1931, in virtually every city in America, the same scene was playing out simultaneously. A woman, in the Bronx, in Pittsburgh, in Memphis, standing at a butcher counter asking for bones. Not meat, bones. Knuckle bones, marrow bones, feet. The butcher gave them away or sold them for pennies. 2 cents a pound in Chicago, free in shops where the butcher knew the neighborhood. The women carried them home, covered them with cold water, and walked away. Over the next 4 to 8 hours, collagen dissolved from the connective tissue into gelatin, giving the liquid body. Marrow melted from inside the long bones and distributed through the broth. Minerals leached from the bone matrix into the surrounding liquid. The women who knew what they were doing roasted the bones first. Dry heat that caramelized the bone's surface proteins and produced a broth that was darker, richer, and more complex than raw bones could ever manage. Into it went charred onion, celery tops the grocer couldn't sell, carrot peels, parsley stems. The parts of things the food system had decided were waste. These women had a different definition. Waste was what you threw away. You did not throw away anything that still had flavor in it. The soup was not a finished dish. It was infrastructure, the base from which every other soup of the week would be built. A cup of it with barley and whatever vegetables were on hand was dinner. A cup stirred with a beaten egg was given to sick children. A cup drunk plain from a mug at the end of a cold day was something the word comfort does not adequately describe. Number 2, dried beans. There is a moment around the 3rd hour of cooking when a pot of dried beans stops smelling like raw starch and starts smelling like food. Not like beans specifically, like warmth, like the particular comfort of something tending itself on a low flame while the rest of life happened around it. In the kitchens of rural Texas and the tenements of the Lower East Side and the mill towns of South Carolina, that smell was the background music of the 1930s. A pound of dried pinto beans cost 3 cents in 1933. It fed a family of 4 as a main dish and left enough for tomorrow. The math was not complicated. The math was the point. Dried beans kept indefinitely, required nothing but water and heat and time, and worked in every culinary tradition simultaneously, becoming Mexican frijoles de olla or Jewish cholent or Southern red beans or Italian pasta e fagioli without ever being anything other than exactly what they were. In the Mexican households of San Antonio's west side, the beans went in with lard, garlic, and epazote, a wild herb that somehow in a bean pot became essential and irreplaceable. In the Jewish households of the Lower East Side, the beans went in with meat scraps and left overnight in a low oven to become colons, dense, dark, savory. In the black households of New Orleans' 7th Ward, red kidney beans went with the Trinity and the Sunday ham bone, cooked until Monday, served over rice still distinct so the beans and their liquor could move through it. Each preparation was a complete technical system, refined over generations, producing a result that the same beans cooked carelessly could never approach. Canned beans expanded aggressively through the 1940s, and the overnight soak disappeared. The 3-hour simmer disappeared. What remained was nutritionally similar and culinarily inferior, lacking the texture of a properly cooked dried bean, and lacking the flavored liquor the bean produced in its own cooking liquid, which was itself a soup requiring nothing further. The dried bean has not needed rehabilitation because it never fully left. It survived in the communities that always cooked it, Mexican American, Caribbean, Southern Black, Appalachian, because in those communities the bean was not just food. It was identity, memory, the specific flavor of a specific grandmother's kitchen, unreplicable from a can regardless of what the label promised. Somewhere right now, someone is starting their beans the night before, the way their grandmother did, the way her grandmother did. The chain has not broken yet. Number 1. The Sunday pot roast. In the winter of 1933, in a row house in Pittsburgh's Hazelwood neighborhood, a steelworker named Edmund Kowalski had been out of work for 14 months. The mill had cut its workforce by 60%. The savings were gone. The credit at the corner store was running thin. On Sundays, his wife Anna made pot roast. Not every Sunday. Some Sundays there was nothing to make it from. But when Anna had saved enough, or when the butcher on Brownsville Road had a tough cut going for 12 cents a pound that nobody else wanted, on those Sundays, the house smelled different. It smelled like the years when the mill was running and Edmund came home with soot on his hands and money in his pocket. And the children knew, from the smell at the door, that Sunday had delivered something. Chuck roast. The shoulder, heavily worked muscle, threaded with connective tissue, impossibly tough if cooked quickly, transformed by long, slow, moist heat into something that required no knife and no apology. Browned first, all 6 sides, in a heavy pot with a thin film of lard, the exterior caramelized fully before turning. Then onions, then liquid. Water if there was nothing else, a splash of vinegar, a can of tomatoes if the week had been decent. Then carrots, potatoes, turnips. The lid went on. The heat went low. Anna left it alone. The collagen in the chuck's connective tissue broke down over the next 2 to 3 hours into gelatin, dissolving into the braising liquid and giving it a richness that no broth made from water alone could replicate. The fat distributed through the meat, basting the fibers from the inside. The vegetables became infused with the flavor of the whole pot. By the time the lid came off, the roast pulled apart with a fork, and the liquid had thickened to a loose gravy without a single added thickening agent. The family ate at the table. In households where meals had been reduced to bowls eaten wherever you could find space, the Sunday pot roast demanded the table. Demanded everyone sit down at the same time. Demanded that Edmund carve even though there wasn't much to carve. The ritual was as nourishing as the food. The table said, we are still a family. We still have Sundays. The Depression has not taken this from us. The pot roast fed them Sunday dinner, Monday lunch, and Tuesday soup from the bones and the braising liquid. The 12-cent piece of chuck fed the family for 3 days. This was not an accident. This was the calculation of a woman who knew exactly what a piece of meat could give if you asked it correctly. A braised short rib at a white tablecloth restaurant costs $40 now, made by the same process Anna used in 1933. It is very good. It is not the same thing. It is not the same thing because it is not feeding anyone for 3 days. It is not producing Tuesday's soup. It is not being carved at a table by a man who has been out of work for 14 months and needs this Sunday, this meal, this smell at the door, to believe that his life will be that way again. If your grandmother made a Sunday pot roast, she knew things no cookbook fully captures. If she is still alive, call her. Don't ask her to describe it. Ask her to show you, with her hands the way she learned it, with someone else's hands, in a kitchen that smelled like the thing being made. If she is gone, make it yourself. Find the cheapest cut the butcher has. Brown it until the crust is dark. Add the onions. Add whatever liquid you have. Put the lid on and leave it alone and let the heat do what heat has always done. Make something extraordinary from something ordinary. Make something worth sitting down to from something that cost almost nothing. Make something that says quietly and without apology that the people at this table are worth the hours it took. The Great Depression did not break the American kitchen. It revealed what the American kitchen had always been. A place where the people with the least made the most, where knowledge mattered more than money, where time and attention and the accumulated wisdom of grandmothers produced food that was more sophisticated, more nutritious, and more deeply human than anything the prosperous years before or after ever gave them credit for. What we lost when we lost this food was not just flavor. We lost the understanding that cooking is not a task to be optimized. It is a practice to be learned slowly from someone who already knows. Leave a comment telling us which dish you'd bring back to your table. And if your family still makes any of these, if someone in your house still starts the beans the night before, still renders the lard, still knows exactly when the broth has given everything it has, tell us. That knowledge is worth more than you know. Don't let it leave the kitchen without being written down.